Namaskara, good evening, and welcome to BIC Streams. Bangalore International Center, or BIC for short, is an inclusive and neutral platform for conversation, intellectual dialogue, exchange of ideas, and the arts. Today's session, Karimeen for the Soul. Savor the rich depths of Malayalam. It is said India reads, but it reads overwhelmingly in Indian languages. And Malayalam literature stands as a stellar example of this statement. In Kerala, a committed and passionate readership, a product of both the literacy and library movements, cuts across all social strata. Malayalam writing crackles with experimentative energy and a willingness to take risks in examining social issues. In recent years, readers unfamiliar with Malayalam have been given the opportunity to savor the riches in this literary terrain. New works reach English readers soon after the initial publication in Malayalam, and literary prizes for translations have brought recognition and widened readership. This evening, we have author Paul Zacharia, author translator Nisha Susan, and publisher Karthika VK speaking with MK Nidheesh to exploring how Malayalam literature has created such depth of readership and how it is now transcending borders of geography and culture to find resonance with a new audience. The full bios of all the speakers will appear in the chat box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you have any questions or comments or anything you'd like to share with the speakers, please feel free to use the Q&A box, which is also at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And now over to Nidheesh.
Hi, everyone. So before I begin, I want to state that this is a completely unscripted, uncuffed chat. I didn't call any of the panelists before the session purposefully and didn't discuss any of the questions or answers because I wanted to be spontaneous discussion. I want to begin with Karthika because I want to create a context for this discussion. It's very rare that four Malus are discussing in English about Malayalam literature. That too, after Malayalam literature have been translated in English and all that. Yeah. So I was worried. I was worried when you moved.
She ran away quickly. I couldn't hear you properly, so I decided to switch off the fan and swelter in true humid Kerala style weather while I talk to
Thanks.
you. For authenticity.
Now I'll wait for the question to end whether you will do it in the right way. So this is very interesting. If you step back and look at it, it's very interesting, right? Because why are we having discussions like this? What is the context of things like this? Of course, we are making a lot of buzz in the national press, I guess. Out of the 4 JCB Prize, India's biggest literary awards, Malayali authors took home 3 of them so far. There are a lot of English language literary events that are happening where Malayali authors are getting invited. I think more Malayali authors are getting published in English right now, by the mainstream English press at least by now, than they were ever before, than any of the Malayali writers were ever before. I once met an author who seems like he's annoyed by one publisher who is constantly asking him, what's new, what's new. Which is very rare. It's a pleasantly annoying thing for him. Where is this coming from as a publisher yourself? What do you see in us? We are very lazy people, and we all of us say that we are right. We want to become writers and movie directors. Basically, we mean we don't want to work. What do you see in us?
So this question actually comes at me from so many different angles. The personal angle to this is very clear for any editor who happens to be Malayali, right? You automatically have an affinity to the language and the writers who write in it. And there is that, let's not set aside parochialism and chauvinism and all the rest of it, that also drives some of this enterprise. But you're always finding that an easier language to access and to work with. And that as an editor, you can bring more to it than editing in any other translation. So you automatically gravitate towards publishing those. And as it happens, I think in English language publishing in India for several years now, I think if you look to the editors who work in trade publishing or even in academic publishing who are inclined to do some translation publishing, there are Bengalis, there are Tamil, and there are Malayalis and Hindi speakers. I don't think it's an accident that these are also possibly the four languages that are the most translated into English. That is one part of it. The second, I think, is simply this that while the Bengali translators and the Bengali milieu seemed to uh, be very attracted to the classics, I mean, everybody had a Tagore translation. In Hindi, everybody had a Premchand translation, and you work within that whole classics thing before you got to the moderns. Somehow, I think Malayalam decided that the moderns are the interesting rights to go to. I remember starting by working on proofing something of Bashir, a translation. MT was an O.V. Vijayan, writers who I think, while they were contemporary for most people, were also somehow also classic already. So I think that helped matters, that you were working with contemporary text, you were publishing contemporary writers who in this fast changing milieu of marketing and publicity, etc., were available to be spoken to and to talk about their work. So that I think also helped Malayalam kind of get ahead in that game. The fact that awards came to these writers and to the books was a big bonus in the last few years. I remember there's a small practical caveat here that a JCB, for instance, only accepts submissions of books that were published in the original, not more than, first they said 7 years, now I think it's 10 years. So if you want to qualify for that, you have to first not be a short story collection, but a novel. And second, you have to have been written by somebody who has published the original within the last 10 years. So that automatically means now publishers are dropping the classics a little bit or only going to the classics for their classics program. And their mainstream publishing, so-called, is to do with the books that have been published in the last 10 years. So that is changing the way we publish. I think all of these factors kind of helped make Malayalam publishing translation what it is today. And I have a whole story about how Paul Zacharia has transformed this for me personally, which I will come to later in the conversation.
Nisha, about the translators, because you are the bridge that connects us to the outside world right now. And to use such a cliche thing, sorry, but still, it is true, right? And what I'm curious about is Karthika has actually read many of these JCB winning books and other translated works, contemporary works by, we can say, new generation authors, but they are basically boomers who are writing in Malayalam right now, and who are in the 30s or 40s, who grew up in the 90s or 1980s and all that. The one thing that I was curious about, even though it is contemporary, but still, it is very rooted. It's very, I think that age of, and Zacharia sir may be able to ponder on this later in our conversation, that age of individualistic writing, that personal tragedy, existential trap of the hero, all those things are gone from Malayalam literature for now, for the large part. People are, the most established authors are writing stories laced with history, geopolitics, environment. It's geography being talked about, environment being talked about, gender, caste, identity, all these contemporary issues are talked about. And they're very rooted. People are suddenly discovering places like Neendakara, and like they're discovering Kumpalangi. And Angamali, of course. And what is the translator? You worked a long time in journalism. First of all, how did you kind of an interest in translation? And during that process, did you feel like this is very rooted work, and how do I translate this to a national audience? Also, why do you think that the national audience is interested in these rooted stories?
Right. I think, okay, so there's a bunch of things going on in your question. So let me just try to let me just say the simple thing first and get that out of the way. So my first translation, I'm an embryonic translator, right? My first translation was of a slim book by K.R. Mira, Cover. She and I have corresponded with each other ever since Arachar was in, it's in the mix. It was being published by the magazines at that point. She gave me permission to get an excerpt translated for a magazine that I was working with, an English magazine that I was working with. So we stayed in touch. On and off, we've talked about my translating something that she's written. I mean, the right time and the right book happened. I did cover it. It worked out well for me. Why do I think it is of interest to the national audience? So the weird thing is, I feel like English language publishing is weirdly parochial in India. I feel like it sort of speaks to each other in a particular way. And I think of Malayalam as an international language. I think of it as an international language, I mean, partly for comedy. I say that I can go anywhere in the world and sort of get by a little by with Malayalam. But I also mean it seriously in the sense of its history, of how the literary world in Malayalam has an ambition which is international. It doesn't feel restricted by will the reader understand this? Will the reader understand the context? Who will read this? It seems to just, like when I read, say, like I read Mustache, and it's just it's like a shock, okay? Because yes, it's rooted, it's about a particular ecology, it's about a particular place, all of that. But the sheer scale of the book, the ambition of the book makes it, anything that any writer from the world should want to engage with. It doesn't matter. It shouldn't be like why would anybody read a 1,000-page Bolaño? It's the same reason. Like when I'm trudging through a Bolaño in a real world, or Bolaño's imaginary world, you're reading it partly for the story, but partly for the gall of the writer, right? Look at that. Look at what he did. Let me just be part of this process and admire it. It's the same way with Harish, and it's the same with me, with Mira or Benjamin or Paul. Like, I think my favorite first story that I read of Paul's was actually set in Delhi. And it was a comment about the literary world. The story was called Moonangada Sahityathinte Andyam. Okay. And it was a comment about the literary world. And, that story is like super funny, and it, takes pot shots at complicit Syrian Christians, and, does like the devil is flying, there's the Pakistani army, something, Indian Air Force, all kinds of things are happening. But there is an assumption that the reader will enjoy it. So I feel empowered by the language for sure, but I also feel empowered by the ambition of Malayali writers, which sort of empowers readers also to say, just come along and we'll have a good time. So that's what works for me.
Zacharia sir, before I ask you any question, I must say that I'm a big fan. I grew up reading the literature. I personally feel like you brought class to the masses. It's like what Ilayaraja did to Tamil music. You stripped it off all the unwanted complexities and all.
That's a very interesting.
Yeah, and I think beyond a writer, you have been more than a ringside observer of this industry, this cultural space, the last 5 decades or so. Both Karthika and Nisha, I guess, they was talking about content actually. The literature has changed in some way that makes it a lot more interesting than it was before. What happened in the last 20 years in Malayalam literature to you? How has it changed? Is it we historically, we didn't have much going on in our state in the last 20 years. We had an election in 2014 which changed things nationally. We discovered Fahad Fasil. We had a great flood. But other than that, we didn't come out of a war or anything. And we are, giving bestsellers one after another. What is happening?
Yeah,
I should mute myself.
Yeah. We
don't mute. Yeah.
We didn't face a war, but there are any number of wars going on inside Kerala. This is the primary thing. And it is between caste and caste, and political party and party, and between intellectual and intellectual, and ideology, etc., etc. So it's not as if there aren't enough conflicts to give rise to um, to books that can create a change. Things are happening. And in fact, as Karthika knows, as Nisha knows, you know also, the novel, Harish's novel, Mustache, Nisha, that was essentially that created a huge problem here because he talked about caste. It is the more he talked about caste, and he was quite ruthless in addressing the problems, the conflicts involved. And it's not as if the problem was that he used a four-letter word in the process of. In fact, he uses many four-letter words all over the place, but uh, caste was a very important factor there, and it's a caste organization that came out against him and the newspaper and the magazine that published it. So what I'm saying is, in the last 20 years or even more, a new generation of writers have taken over, very bright, very politically motivated, extremely political, very clear cut and clear headed about, about what they want. And they have moved away from the romantic stream. Um, the modernists had managed to move away somewhat, but still it was haunted by the by a certain kind of romantic language, and that romantic language was taken to its peak by Vijayan. Vijayan was a master of transforming the old romantic language into very contemporary terms, and fascinatingly, something that captured a whole generation of people, but yet it was not romantic writing. He was changing the language, using not even romantic terminology, but it was romantic. So things are moved away. See, at that time, a lot of youngsters were writing, and they were quite a lot imitating him or trying to redo what he did, which is impossible. So it is not only because that's impossible, but people moved away. The concerns changed. When Vijayan wrote Khasakandi Itihasam, the essential concern, disillusionment with with the Communist Party, disillusionment with life, unemployment. You have no way to express your love for a woman, and all kinds of things were happening, and both men and women were deeply in a kind of problem. All that has changed. Kerala has changed. So the literary change that has, and there are people, take Meera and Aracha, for example. Meera chose, Kolkata as the locale of her novel, and decided to write a novel which was utterly unromantic and clear cut, and in fact even prosaic. That is not a small decision coming from a. At that time, Meera was an emerging writer, or she was just establishing herself. It's a very tough decision to take. So, writers of the new generation, I'm putting Meera into that new generation of writers. Maybe the last of my group, maybe N.S. Madhavan is where I would play. So they chose different ways of doing it, and they were not afraid of facing the kind of as I said, the kind of conflicts that are going on, and the decadence of Kerala's caste-ridden, feudalistic, male-dominated society. That is what they really addressed in absolutely clear-cut terms. So that seems to have, I'm surprised it has a readership when translated. That's a different matter. As Karthika knows better than me, why somebody would want to read about all this. But there are people reading about it. Of course, Meera's was a very different cup of tea. That because she was dealing with a national or with characters who had a much broader place than the Malayali kind of situation. But like Benjamin, I'll just last one. Benjamin's the novel which won the JCB award. It's set in Bahrain.
In fact, most of our bestsellers are set outside Kerala.
Most of our bestsellers?
Isn't like most of our bestsellers are set outside Kerala?
Many of them are outside Kerala, and even from. So this is the change. things have changed. It has changed completely from the kind of writing my generation was doing. And
but just before I move on for the question, I just want to ask you. You talked about how the writers have changed. Isn't it also the case that the readers have also changed in Kerala? I'm not talking about the English readers, but these books are coming to English after they become
yes,
bestsellers in Malayalam.
after they have, yes, the readers have changed tremendously. And from what I hear from my bookseller friends, like bookseller friends, the sales are excellent. People are buying books. It's not as if the whole, the online culture has brought publishing and books to an end. No, it's a very thriving literary atmosphere as far as I understand it. And from the way I see books are selling, and from the way the books of some of these young writers are moving into second, third, fourth edition in a matter of, say, 2 or 3 months or 3 or 4 months, which was unheard of in Kerala literature. So the people are actually, I don't even know who are doing this reading, but somebody is doing it, and somebody
People
is
are
doing
buying it. Doesn't mean they're reading it, but they're buying it.
People are. I suppose Malayalis wouldn't waste money like that. I mean, unless it's a multi-volume encyclopedia which you want to put in your reading in your drawing room. Otherwise, they wouldn't. For 150 rupees they pick, or 200 rupees they pick up a book so that they will read it. They can read. I think youngsters are reading, and lots of people in the middle-aged group are reading. It's a very good sign for a language and for a literature.
Okay. Karthika, I'll come back to you about this thing. Give us like behind the scenes, what happens, how do you discover these writers, whether what kind of book you want to translate to English, how do you decide whether it would work with the national audience or not, and basically how do you discover these writers? Is it hard or easy to kind of discover these regional language writers?
I think there's a certain pattern that has been established now, which is that in the past, it seems to me that mostly it was the translators who approached publishers. They would say that the authors themselves, I think, tended to be fairly reticent about putting their work out in other languages. At least that's how I think about it. And the translators would come to the publishers and say, we have translated some part of a novel or short story collection, and the author has given us permission. So will you look at it? And usually the research that was done at the publisher's end was to go back and see what that writer meant to the original language audience. So how does that writer sell or get received in Malayalam in this case? How are they reviewed? What do people have to say about them? What are the numbers like, etc.? It was rarely about looking at what would this do in English. There was, I think, the assumption that if it has worked in that language and in that market, then it's worthy in some way of being translated into English. There are lots of problems with that approach because clearly these are very different readerships. The translation itself is going to mediate in a way that you cannot always foretell what the result will be, especially if you're looking at perhaps sometimes the biodata of a translator and a sample translation. You haven't even read the whole work because editors in the most publishing houses are not capable of reading the original work themselves. So they have to depend on other people telling them what they think of the work. And so gradually, a kind of system of depending on reliable readers came to be. I think Katha was very important in this process. Katha was a small publishing house that started up in the 90s, I think, in Delhi. And Katha's motivation was to publish translations primarily to start with. So they started to run a competition, a kind of national contest on for the best translated story. And then they would do these Katha volume prize collections. What do they call them? Prize winning stories or something like that.
Prize winning stories.
Yeah. So those collections, I think, introduced a lot of readers to a lot of new writers. I remember being on a sort of jury or something, not like the final jury that decided who won it, but there was a shortlisting jury. I was a young editor at Penguin then. And if I remember right, it was N.S. Madhavan's story that was the story that was being translated for the contest. And there was so much that one did not know about the various languages, and Katha made it a point to do as many languages as possible. So the volumes used to be really much awaited by readers because there was no other place to go to get what was happening in contemporary writing in the languages and to be able to read good fiction, well translated, well edited. So I think that was a very, very important step forward for mainstream publishing and translation. After that, I think it was a matter of gradually realizing who among these writers were actually finding a national audience, and then going back to the same writers more or less to say, give us the next book and the next book and the next book. And then, such a, as I said, a pattern was established in that process. But sometimes it would be that a writer would tell us that they have read or know of some work which they really think should be translated. And this is another thing that I think we pay too little attention to, which is the generosity of writers who are not so focused on just their work or getting their own work, publicity or publishing, etc. They're often so generous about their conversations about young writers. I remember sitting with O.V. Vijayan and during the editing process, and he would be telling me who he thought were, the good writers in Kerala at that time, or who he thought we should read. Similarly, with every other writer, I think there's been conversations about who they themselves have been impressed by. And I think, Paul, there is a certain sort of culture, I think, of young writers approaching senior writers for their reading, for a take or opinion. There seems to be a lot of give and take. I don't know
Yeah.
this well
That's
enough.
true.
Yeah, but it filters back to us as editors. And often that becomes the reason we would go after a book. For instance, if J. Devika, who has translated a lot of books from Malayalam for various publishers, including us, when Devika says, you really should publish Shahabuddin, I love his stories, and I'm translating something, would you like to read a story or two? There is an automatic relationship of trust there with the translator. When Nisha says, I want to publish, well, it's about anybody. I'm going to be Nisha, it's about you. If you value that work, we value it automatically. We know we can trust that. So, right at the beginning, it was only the translators who I think came to us. But now it's a combination of writers, translators, and in some cases, editors who can actually read the source language
Original.
and can do the translation if editing effectively.
But you realize that this is a trusting Malayali kind of is a double-edged sword because Malayalis behave in a different way than
Trusting
national.
Malayali women is never a problem, Nidheesh.
Oh,
Okay.
whoa.
No,
Oh.
I'm saying we don't eat like the
Small
rest
murder.
of the country. We don't eat like the rest of the country. We don't vote like the rest of the country. Our literature is not like the rest of the country. Many maybe like sharply political words. So, were you worried at any
Sometimes
point?
I think, Nidheesh, that whole social media world that we've created around us and the way the Malayali projects Malayali-ness and Kerala and the way other states and readers from other places are consuming this Kerala identity that has become so prominent. I feel like that is, feeding into this need to read Malayalam also. It's become a little bit trendy. Malayali is cool. Malayalam conversations, especially on social media, hey, we don't quite get them. They're kind of weird, but they seem to speak up and they have fun. And clearly, they're all having a ball out there. So maybe the writing reflects that. It has helped that there are often reviewers and good reviewers who have connections with Kerala, editors. Prasanna Rajan, who edits Open Magazine, is the one who first introduced me to Unniyar's stories. He's like, have you read Unniyar? Let me send you a proposal, like, a collection of stories. And that's how so I think it's about enough Malayalis out there and enough interest in the conversations around Kerala and in Kerala that has really helped take this to the next level for us.
Nidheesh, can I add one point?
Yeah, sure.
Karthika said, because it's also, Nisha is here, the arrival of excellent translators. We never had it actually. 20 years back, maybe we can go a little further, maybe 25 years back. Translation, it's very hard to find good translators from Malayalam to English. I'm sure Karthika is aware of that. But today there are people who are doing an excellent job of this. So many people translating from English to Malayalam is sometimes very shoddy, but from Malayalam to English, this is working very well. Without these translators coming in and taking an active role, as Karthika said, in and taking it very seriously. Translation as a job, like I know how Devika does it. It's almost like she's writing a new novel or writing a new work. That much effort she puts into it. So this, I think, influenced or helped Malayalam to reach in good, efficient, contemporary English language to reach across to people who are to the non-Malayali audience. I think that was a very big thing. We didn't have that thing in when Karthika and I did our book. Of course, at that
Well,
time.
you must allow me to tell that story.
Please do.
Yeah.
Karthika,
No,
please
I
go
think,
ahead.
shall I tell you about Paul's translation? So what Paul says is absolutely true, that in the early days, I mean, I'm thinking about someone like the good Abdullah translating M.T. Vasudevan. There were limitations. There was this whole, I think the word faithful was often used in all of these early conversations about translation. It was about the original language. It was not about the language in which it was being translated into. There was a great need to be seen to be translating. So the process had to be transparent. Malayalam words had to be used to capture what they call the flavor. I mean, that was not just Malayalam, but across the board, I think translators and translations seem to work in that way. And then Paul, I was working with Paul on a book that we eventually titled The Reflections of a
Reflections
Hen
of a Hen.
in the 11th Hour. And so Paul was not easy to work with. Paul had opinions about every word that one edited. There was A.J. Thomas's translations that we were working on.
And Geeta Krishnan.
Yes, and Geeta's correct was also there from the Bhaskara Patelar collection. Her stories were in it. But what Paul did was he said, I don't care if this was what the original story in Malayalam did. This is going to an English reading reader. And I don't like the story in Malayalam in the same way anymore. So you, Paul, basically ripped apart some of the stories and redid them, shortened them, pulled them into a slightly different shape. And so suddenly translation was not about being faithful or communicating or conveying what the original meant to say. This was introducing the work of Paul Zacharia to a reader who's reading in the English. And let's not forget that is what is happening here. It's not about the process of translation or, foregrounding the process of translation, etc. So I think that was a really valuable lesson. It wasn't just a lesson that Paul taught me as an editor, because obviously these are conversations that we all have within. So, I mean, I was talking about this to the rest of the editors at Penguin. It became something that we discussed. It became something other people talked about. So gradually, one writer after the other, we realized we're now beginning to say, well, if I'm not able to, like Paul was in a situation where positioned to be able to rewrite it himself into English. But there were other writers who said, I see that that's a good idea and I can't do it myself, but I'm going to trust the editor to do it. So we actually moved like many steps forward in that process of saying the editor can perhaps take some more liberties than were permitted earlier. So the reflections of a hen in her 11th hour, I think really changed the way translations were edited.
Okay, Nisha, I think this. It's very evident. Translators are the fulcrum of this industry. That's the axis in which this whole thing revolves. But I personally feel that there are like Zacharia said, there are a lot of not only new translators who can write English well and who understand the prose well, but also they come with a lived experience of what is being written about. Jayasri, for example, or you, for example, knows, and they have an rooted understanding of this Malayali life that's being there in the pages. And that kind of helps, I guess. But I want to ask you about other side of the story. This whole translation business, how rewarding it is for you. Is it, the work, like Zacharia sir said, it's like writing a whole new book. And we never know whether, the publishers who are talking very highly about Malayalam literature now will see it like fashion. They'll move on to another geopolitical entity after some time. It will become the flavor of the season. So,
Uzbek. Okay.
yeah. So how we all understand it's fascinating, but what do you think about the rewards? How do you think it could sustain itself?
Right. So I think that's interesting. So I have a bunch of different things that, I mean, I didn't have a plan to become a translator, but now that I've, like had a taste of it, I really like want a lot of it. So there's a bunch of different things going on. I think at the top of the list is that my mother likes me much more than she did before. That's like a number one factor. I mean, my mother always liked me, but now I'm like her favorite child. If there were 100 of us, I would be her most favorite child right now. So when Mira first asked me in a sort of serious way, I made the mistake or correct decision, whichever, to tell my mother. And my mother was like the most Yugo girl about this decision than my entire career. Okay, so generally we leave each other alone to do things, but this, she was like fully tiger mom, and she found some Vanita cover which had Arundhati Roy and her translation, which itself is like a mind-blowing thing, like national circulation, Vanita magazine, Arundhati Roy and translated on the cover. Just mind-blowing. Anyway, so she took that and she said, Ninne kondum pattumida. Okay. And I was like, yes. Okay. So that sort of helped. So that was one decision. The other is, I mean, my long-term ambition for myself was to somehow get into Malayalam writing, as like to get my work translated into Malayalam. So, that's that I still have a little way to go for that. But this seemed like a leap, sort of, to engage with it much more seriously, and this whole process of translating Mira has been also like a way of educating myself around what people are writing. Like I read your Harish profile and I sent it to everybody I know. So Nidheesh wrote this profile of Harish, which should be framed. It's so funny. And it's so like distilling literary culture and, all his cynicism and like deep affection for Malayalis. Yes.
Actually, when Zacharia sir was talking about Harish provoking people, I was just laughing inside my head because I just read the review copy of his latest novel. It's about to publish it. So if Nisha was provocative, I don't know what this will become. It's kind of it's sort of everything that you expect from.
So Nidheesh had gone into that zone. So he had like had some osmosis situation, and like adding to his own provocation had written this Harish profile where Harish says, that the villagers were like okay with his getting this big prize only after they found out that the translator was going to take 50% of the money. Then they were like, okay. I mean, otherwise this was too much. So all of that, like, sort of education about like what people are writing and just like that whole thing, that's a big reward. But I think at a baseline, I think what has worked for me in this process, as I said, as an embryonic translator, is that I really felt that all the language geek in me that had no outlet ever, particular outlet ever, came into play in translation in a way that it doesn't work in writing my own stuff. I mean, writing my own stuff is another sort of experience, but translation is like some different part of my brain, and it's really thrilling. I mean, it's like if you get into it, it's super addictive, and if you like the work, it's super addictive. I mean, I didn't have I think the next book is going to be harder because I didn't have too much like things to worry about when I did this one. I could make as many mistakes as I could, but I've noticed the kind of things that people have responded to, like people have asked me, how did you decide to choose this word? And they've looked at me sharply, like as if I had made some big decision. But actually, I was just like, typing at that point. But that process now, when I think about it, those 2-3 months when I was working on it, it was just the best. I loved it.
Okay. And Zacharia sir, I have a very personal question. This is something I feel like often kind of an injustice that's happening whenever these kind of conversations happen. Like in this panel, we don't have a Sarish or Vinay Thomas or any of these new generation writers. I think the best of Malayalam writing is happening in short form, short story writing, and maybe because we have certain publications, we have certain print publications that feature all these short stories, and those short stories are yet to be translated, and those are like the most interesting I'm talking about, not just Harish, but, whether it's GR in the Goban or whether it's, all interesting stories. Just for context, I would like to quote the stories of two short stories. One, I guess it's from Indigoban, this short story about a prostitute taking revenge on a police officer.
Hmm.
And in a very violent fashion, like almost Tarantino like movie kind of a fashion. There is another story of S. Harish where a lower caste family, which has become an upper middle class family now, finds a problem with the Srinarayana Guru photo in their house. And when there is a marriage proposal coming for a daughter in the family, they're wondering what to do with the Narayana Guru family. And finally, they removes it and replaces it with the this thing, Bruyerapan photo. It's such a personal story, but there's a lot of social commentary. When do we get to see, translations of these kind of work? And what do you generally think about, these kind of short story landscape in Malayalam? We never talk about it so much, right?
You mean, what do I generally think about short stories?
The short stories, and what do you think will be the reception for those short stories if they
Yeah,
get
I
translated?
think, as you said, there are any number of journals today, plus a lot of online websites where you can publish short stories, and you can actually publish all kinds of things that even sexually explicit things which otherwise in our times, for example, no editor would have touched, and the younger generation wants to talk about it, and even they can publish it in online especially. And I think right from the start, the maximum quantity of or extent of experimentation and new writing and innovation was happening in the short story from the 50s onwards. I'll say from Bashir and even from Karur and Tagari onward. And it came to the, Bashir and Madhavi Kuti, Kamala Das, they brought it to the modernist period. And then my generation and all took over, and they were there all the time. Madhavi was very much there, very actively writing. So the short story has a special place as the area where literature keeps coming alive every now and then when people think it is dead, when people think it's over. Because novels, I think, there are fantastic writers like Navandan and company who are fairly brilliant, but the canvas is so big, the experimentation and originality, or whatever you want to call it, that gets lost in the total thing. But the short story is like a small little gem, like a gemstone. It hits you hard. So that is, I think, the reason why. And many people get into writing short stories because it is much easier than writing a 500, 300, 400 page novel. So you are creative. Now the question of how do we get to see them translated in English, for example? I think publishers will have to take publishers in English, they will have to take as Karthika said, they will have to take a very difficult decision whether, for example, in the government, or only this book came out very. I think Nisha, you translated only? No.
No.
So this book came out like so many youngsters. So in the government, if you take some publishers has to decide to publish in the government stories as a book. That may not be very easy. On the other hand, what I am suggesting is, what I am thinking is, there could be an anthology of contemporary Malayalam short story, for example, which hasn't yet come out, and that can be it can showcase the younger writers, one story, two stories from the younger people, and that can make a big difference. Actually, only thing is, as I always say, I'm Katia and I have discussed it many times. You should translate a story not for its worth in Malayalam, but for its possible worth in English, speaking to people who have perhaps no idea about Kerala or about. So if that story doesn't address those reading concerns, then you may have a problem. So I think a very deft, very intelligent editorial sense is required to make the selection of such a collection. Maybe you can have you remember, Penguin used to bring out yearly volumes of
Modern
contemporary,
Indian
the
short
new
stories.
English short story, etc. Can be done in any language, not only in Malayalam. Can be. I think that may be the only way it can be done.
Actually, we don't have a national publication for short stories. Uh,
We do have, we have.
we don't have,
No, we
right?
don't have.
We don't have any, none of the major newspapers or magazines have a space for showcasing short stories like we have in Malayalam. But,
Yeah.
just to kind of, and I don't question to that, like, why do you think what are the things that you see in Malayalam short stories right now that are really interesting for you? I personally feel like, they are doing experimentation. Everybody is talking about Malayalam cinema right now, doing innovation, experimentation, and all that. But I think Malayalam short stories are on another level. The Malayalam cinema can never catch up with Malayalam short stories. Some of the issues that we are kind of bringing into short stories. Just one example of this recent short story by this guy. I forgot his name. He's into movies and all. It's a story about a daughter-in-law, kind of a woman who is kind of unhappy in her family life, in her married life, has kind of an affair with her father-in-law, and it's a very intimate affair. And the father-in-law becomes kind of guilt-ridden, and he commits suicide or something. And when the body has to be identified, the woman is the only one who identifies the body, but she can't really reveal that to the police because then the affair will be out. These kind of stories, Malayalam cinema has never given these kind of stories to us. It's that morality comes in play. So, what do you think about the short stories that are coming out now? Are they like, what are the interesting things in those short stories that kind of,
So as I said, these are. Can you hear me?
yeah.
Because there's a very heavy downpour going outside. That's why I put this on.
Okay, good
Raining
for you.
heavily. Yeah. So these are stories that address all kinds of concerns, that address very strange situations like New Malayalam cinema, for example. They go in for situations that we haven't really seen in cinema or in this. So this is an imagination that's working in a very very different kind of way, and there are lots of readers. The stranger it is, the more bizarre it is, there are more readers. Sometimes people are, some of these writers are taking it to an extreme of bizarreness that can make you puke. That is also there. But in general, it is within control and it's a free for all. In other words, I think Malayalam publishing, both print and online together, has acquired a lot of freedom. That gives a lot of freedom to the young writers, and they are able to, if they wish to, they can, you know say almost anything. So and as I said, innovation has always been the hallmark of the short story in Kerala. So I mean, that's the only way I can look at it.
Karthika, I mean, to kind of continue with that question, when do we get to see, all these great short stories translated to English?
You've just planted an idea, no, Paul, about the modern short stories
Yeah.
annuals that we will now soon be
Yeah.
publishing. And it is difficult. The thing is that across the board, not just in translation, but even when you look at the novel and the short story, say written even originally in the English or in another language, the novel seems to completely trump the short story collection in the marketplace. Readers seem to want the novel over the short story collection when they go out to buy books. It's very rare that we find like Nisha's collection of stories that came out, which was her first book published in English. Uh, that I think is one of those that beat the odds. But for the most part, you find that a short story collection comes out and there's a lot of good reviewing and a lot of very interesting conversations around it, maybe. But sales are very slow. So that is where I think we fall back on the novel, even in translation. Again, as I said, the say the JCB prize or many of the prizes don't even look at short stories for nomination. You have to submit only the novel. So all of these feed into that idea that the novel is somehow superior. is somehow the more sort of interesting thing to publish. And it has been continuing for a long time. I think every now and then when a really good short story collection comes out, everyone talks about why we don't read more stories. There's a lot of conversation around people, younger people, digitally savvy people preferring to read the short story on their screen and not read the whole novel. But we haven't seen it convert into sales for a physical book. So one of the things is possibly that there are two sets of readerships here. One is the sort that prefers to read almost exclusively on the screen, on their phone, on their devices, whatever they read on. And they like reading the short story. They like spending that amount of time on reading, etc. But that's not necessarily the same profile as the person who goes to a bookstore and buys a book. And that person who seems to go to the bookstore and buys the book or browses the fiction section seems to settle on the novel far more than they settle on the short story collection. It could be that there are short story collections with a thematic sort of whole, which there was a time when that worked so well that editors would compulsorily fit every short story collection into a thematic whole and put one title. So you fooled the reader, you thought. So, for instance, you said The Girls of Brewster Place was a short story collection, but it pretended to be a novel. You didn't have the word stories anywhere, you just had a title. So all of those things were tried, and it was all under the assumption that the novel will work much better for the reader. So we are still stuck in that place, which is, I think, what prevents us from being able to publish more short story collections in a year than fic novels as a whole. I like what Aleph is doing with their short story collections, which is, I mean, it's a bit bombastic to say the greatest stories ever told, but in each language, they have a collection of really great stories. And you're building a little library like that. At the end of maybe 10 years, 12 years, you have a shelf which has the greatest stories ever told in these languages. That's a great selection to have and to dip into and read and get a sense of what other languages are doing. So like this modern writing collection that you're saying, I think we just need more and more anthologies and collections to add on to this. But I suspect the sales numbers will always be less unless we can transform that distribution space somehow and make sure that the people who don't at the moment buy books like this, libraries, and there are so many libraries that could actually buy if they wanted to. If there was a way to push this to them and say, don't just buy nonfiction, don't just buy, poetry, buy also the short stories equally interesting for you to buy. I think all of those factors would have to come in for us to make this actually count as a new and more exciting way of publishing.
It's like, to me, it's very interesting because, as a journalist, when I look at it, and I step back and look at it, many of these short stories find a fresh life as movies, and they release on OTTs, and the non-Malayali audience kind of, kind of enjoys it all over the world, and they become box office hits, they become OTT hits. All these short stories are, so I think some part of this story kind of attracts to even a non-Malayali English-speaking audience. And many of the Malayalis also, but the people who live outside Kerala, all those people, they're interested in these stories. But only if if it's coming as movies. Also, I think we should make a mention about the poems also, I guess, because personally I feel this is a golden age of Malayalam poems in a way. After a long time, we see a lot of substantially good subaltern poems, all sorts of poems, poems of people like escalation and all. They take you to another place, and they all have quite a good readership in the regional language. But none of these are kind of translated. Even recently in that book, Jita edited modern Indian poems.
Yeah.
I find there are very few regional poets, if any, I guess. And how do you see that part about the short stories taking fresh life as movies and then becoming hits, and also the poem space?
It has a lot to do with of course, the appropriate story that is fit for a movie that will be enjoyed by Malayalis and as well as by others. But essentially, of course, it's a combination of the director, the script writer, and the short story writer. or the novel writer. So that is something that's a formula almost. If I don't want to name all there are so many young directors today looking for innovative teams in Malayalam cinema and making excellent movies, which are very very unusual movies. So it is not as if so they are hunting around for stories. But Nidheesh, I think the essential thing now going on is they prefer to create their own stories actually because they have more confidence there. Because
I think, sir,
they're creating it for a particular purpose. They have a movie in mind, and so they
yes.
create a story that fits that thing they have in their mind. That is also there, but they're also picking up because the entire Malayalam cinema industry was 50, 60 years ago built on literature. It was only around the 90s that stories that were independent from literature came into war. And now there is a mixture, it's a hybrid. There are stories from literature and stories that are but it's working. At the end of the day, something is happening which is benefiting everyone. That is what.
Which is
That's
making
like,
people rich also. I think nowadays you can be a writer, you can simply be a writer and
yeah, you
be a
can be.
millionaire also,
You
which
can.
I guess was not possible
Yes.
before.
No, it used to be even slightly older days, but it is now much easier.
But you yourself had to keep a day job and then a writer's career also. But many of the elder generation writers had a day job as a government officer or something,
Yeah.
and on
Most
the parallel they had a writing career. But nowadays, if you look at Benjamin, Mira, they are all back
stand
substantially.
alone. They are on their own. Most of them, Unni, and I mean, they all left their jobs and came and went into full time writing. There are so many of so many.
I think you're bang on that particular note on that thing about directors looking for a certain sense of. I felt it most when Lijo took his own liberties and made a movie from a series short story called Maoist. He made Jellicate from Maoist. Maoist was a completely different beast, and Jellicate is a different thing altogether. But don't you think it works the other way also? Like writers in Malayalam writing for movies, or in the hope that it would create a national audience, it would attract certain political audience or certain movie audience. Don't you think that's also
Not
working?
all the writers. There are quite a few who very honestly does it. That's what
Please
I'm.
don't be so polite. Please let
No,
us.
I'm not.
I
They are
have a question
Yeah,
whenever,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. Please.
they're specifically in it to write stories which will work as literature as well as which can work as a base for a film story. They're doing that. I think it's perfectly all right. All the great writers we know, even Hemingway, I think used to be hackers in Hollywood for years together, doing rubbish work. So there is nothing to be ashamed of that, I think.
Okay.
And like Indu Gopan, for example, almost every story he writes is immediately picked up by a film director. But they are excellent stories in their own right. That's what I'm saying.
Uh,
I don't think if somebody asked me to write a story which would go in for which can fit a movie, I don't think I'll be able to do that.
I want to ask Nisha something. You said you have a question.
Yeah. Actually, I was just thinking that this is possibly the only group of people who can answer this question for me. So I was thinking, we've been talking a lot about translating back and forth between Malayalam and English. And I think about 10 years ago, I went to Jaipur Lit Fest. Perhaps it's the last time I went. And that was a year in which, as a reporter, I met a lot of people writing in other languages. And that was my focus of my reporting that year. And then I remember thinking it would be so interesting if X person who's a short story writer in Ganganagar in Rajasthan, their work would be translated into Malayalam, or it could be translated into Odia. That in internal languages translation thing was something that I was thinking about then. And I've been thinking about it again now, because now the possibility of, say, okay, now I've translated Kabar into English, the possibility of it translating into another language, into Bangla or Tamil or something, is very interesting for me, as in that my translation would be used as a vehicle for it to reach new audiences. I was thinking of somebody like, say, Vijila Charapad, the poet, or someone like that, where one could even just think of English as just a hop for a national audience in which she could reach a much wider audience. I wondered what you thought of the present and the history of that, where Malayalam has gone into other Indian languages. Has there been some of that? What the
I
trajectory of it has been?
think,
Yeah.
Actually, the brief version, what I was asking,
yeah.
what is the like the past and the present in terms of Malayalam writing translated into other languages, either via English or directly?
Oh, yeah. You mean to other Indian languages?
Indian languages, yeah.
I don't think that's happening much. I know it is being translated quite a lot into Tamil, a little bit into Kannada, that much I know. And I think if you take a language like Hindi or some of these, is to, the Malayalam gets across to most of the Indian languages is via the NBT anthologies and the Sahitya Academy anthology. And they are the only people who translate. For example, if you have a Academy Award winning novel or a collection, like my collection of short stories, I think they have translated into, not only mine, each one of these, they translate it into all the major Indian languages. That is the agency that does it, actually. Sahitya Academy. Otherwise, who would want to, I don't know. Malayalis want to read everything that is written in every other language. There's no doubt about it. And it's being translated heavily from Tamil, from Bengali, from, there was a time when Shankar wrote a novel in Bengali, it was almost simultaneously translated here.
Wow.
So, we had such brilliant translators too. So, and even now it's going on. But from Malayalam to other languages, I think only Tamil is taking in a lot of translations. And, a couple of Jayasri and her sister, in Tiruvannamalai, they are the people who started the process. Then there are many others, the poet Sukumaran and many others who are doing a brilliant job of translating from Malayalam to the best writing. Into Balchandran Chullikad was translated. And if you will not mistake that I am boasting, I have 14 books in Tamil. So, this is many people, Bashir also has, like that. So this is happening. I am not alone. There are many other writers who are moving into Tamil. Because I'll just add this, because Tamil had a problem. Tamil literacy just skyrocketed at a point of time. And there wasn't enough reading material to feed the new audience that was coming up. I think there was an educational, primary education revolution there during the last 23 years. So they started translating. And the easiest place was from Malayalam because the languages are nearly, very closely interconnected. That's all.
Can I just add, Nidheesh, that I think also during the 60s and the 70s, and maybe even earlier, I don't know, there was so much traffic between Kerala and West Bengal. People moved to Calcutta then, I suppose, to live and work. And they were a particular breed of Malayalis who seemed to assimilate completely. They spoke Bangla, they listened to Bengali music, they read the writers I wanted to know, and they felt the sense of connection, I think, there, and they lived there for many years.
Kamala Das says she's a product of Calcutta.
Yeah, so I think maybe that trail has gone cold now, and where the economy goes, where people go alongside, that's where the translations are obviously going to flourish. And so, not having translators who can deal with that other language as well, that must be what is also restricting this. Now, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, perhaps there is that connection still.
There's a lot of
Karnataka, there is.
There is.
Maybe there isn't enough anymore with Bengal or other places, and that's probably why there isn't.
Actually, there are a lot of Bengalis being represented as characters in Malayalam short stories and novels now, but as guest laborers. But I want to add to what Zacharia said. Isn't it also a function of the whole thing about regional publishing industry? We paint a glossy picture about the regional literature, forgetting that those who make it happen are absolutely poor. They work in pitiful conditions. I was, in the last few days, had a personal experience. I went to Kerala International Film Fest. For the whole time, I was along with someone. I don't want to name him, but he was an editor in a prestigious Malayalam publication, and I think he could be fairly credited for discovering many of the gems that we are talking about right now. Harish, or Binoy Thomas, or all these guys, Francis Narona, all these new generation Malayalam authors, he discovered them, he gave them publishing space, and they published their first stories with him. And then they, kind of were taken over by other bigger publications and were celebrated and later got published to English and all that. This guy works for a pitiful salary. He works 200 kilometers away from his wife. His organization don't want him to give a transfer. There's no doubt that he's going to quit that industry sooner or later, and he wants to live a prosperous life like any of us. And with him gone, there won't be that there won't be that guardian angel to kind of give life to all these authors. I think the same thing is happening with regional industries also, right? In Tamil or Bangla, the regional marketplaces are in shambles. Malayalam is still, I think, fairly good, but we forget that a bunch of writers not so long ago came up with an anthology titled "Writers Exiled by Mainstream Malayalam Press." There were a lot of small town, bookshops and bookstores that were shut down during the last 20 years. Absolutely, after COVID, even the bigger ones are suffering. So, isn't it also a function of the marketplace itself? And I see a lot of people of my generation, the Gen Z, or whatever you want to call them, millennials, they don't read Malayalam. They understand Malayalam, they speak Malayalam, but they don't read Malayalam literature unless it's coming as in translation, or wherever, however it's kind of accessible to them. Isn't that also the case of this lacking of give and take, like Nisha said,
Lacking of
give and take between our regional languages, and lacking give and take of ideas and all that?
no, I don't think it's like that. It's a matter of like Tamil took books from Malayalam because there was a urgent need, a real need for books to fill up their and to cater to their growing reading public. Now, whether Kannada, of course, some of the better known writers have been translated into Kannada, but not really that much as Tamil. So I think this is something that has to be managed consciously by some kind of an agency like the National Book Trust. If you remember, there was 15 years, maybe 10 years back, 15 years back, there was a tremendous organization called the National Translation Mission. Karthika, you remember that?
Yeah.
It was in Mysore, and
Yeah.
Mr.
Was it Uday Prakash?
No, not Uday Prakash. It was one Mr. Singh, who was a very,
Okay.
very so this National Translation Mission's mission was to encourage translations between Indian languages rather than into English, so that you could speak, translate directly from Hindi to Malayalam, or Marathi to Malayalam, etc., etc. But that at some point of time, I think somebody lost track of it, and maybe it is still existing. I don't know. So I think because it's such an uncertain field, as Karthika said, where you can make an investment and be sure that you will get your money back. So I think an agent, only a central governmental agency or a voluntary agency that is willing to put money into an effort like this. I mean, we used to have words like national integration and all. So using such words, you can get writers to get.
Oh, we're all laughing at the word national integration.
I mean, at this
Integration.
point, I don't think the government's attempt is to unify anything. It is to divide, not unite. So
Well,
I'm not sure you're going with the mood.
It's actually, I think, a great point, because even for me, many of these books like Yayadi or Shivaji or Sulita Gopade, all those books I read in Malayalam, not in their original languages.
Yeah, this translator died yesterday.
Oh, yeah.
P. Madhavan Pilla. Yeah.
Madhavan Pillai.
Okay.
So Nisha, I want to come back to the English translated Malayalam books. There's something I want to ask the journalist in you. The kind of books that are being translated, and Karthika kind of mentioned it earlier about it's kind of a fashion statement now because there are the certain politics that appeals to, and I see it as a positive thing. I want to get a sense of have you thought about it? Like books of K.R. Meera talks to women not just in Kerala. It talks to a pan-Indian audience, and women more than men, I guess, would kind of would empathize with it, would understand what she talks about, and men also would understand it, empathize with it. But I guess it's very personal. It's those experiences are very. It's not just restricted to particular geography, right? So these sentiments, have you given a thought about how these sentiments kind of attract readers to these particular literary texts?
Don't quite understand your question. What's your question?
So this, many of these novels and short stories that are being written in Malayalam and translated, I see a lot of them touching on sentiments that appeal to a national audience. Like K.R. Meera work, for example, it comments a lot on gender. Kabar, for example, it's about on the one hand a married couple, a husband and his wife, and on the other hand, it's also about the wife's career and how faith and law kind of interplays in it. So this, but the gender angle in it speaks to a larger audience, right? And do you think those kind of things kind of work in favor of Malayalam literature? That is possibly one reason why it's kind of getting a large, wide audience across India.
Interesting. So I'm not quite sure still about this question, but let me just say it's really, I grew up reading two kinds of Malayalam literature. One is literature in the books, and the other is magazine novels, the serialized novels, right? And then there's an overlap, like somebody like Meera would appear in both spaces. She would appear in a book and she would also appear in a magazine. You would read it in the magazine, then you would read it as a book, you'd buy the book. So I'm quite comfortable with the idea of like high literary fiction written for a mass audience. And in that sense, Paul's work or Harish's work or Meera's work or Benjamin's work all appeals to me as a model of how to be as a writer in the world, to be really ambitious literary, but imagine that your audience is pretty much everybody. What is special for me with Meera is that she's a woman and she is a feminist, and she writes about the particular lived experiences of all kinds of women, and certainly it appeals to a lot of women. But I also think that my friends and I talk about this often, that something that happens in Meera's books is also the central appeal of, say, Korean dramas, which is that there is a very, very robust attention to emotional trajectories, right? And there is no pretense that now I will write a historically situated novel, or I'll write a novel in a particular political situation, and in that old style Bernard Shaw sort of way, all the characters will be little puppets saying the right things. It isn't. What holds the book together is the emotional journey, or what holds a K-drama together is the emotional journey. And often those books and those works of culture are condemned or put in a separate category for being so, and it is put in a separate category for being gendered in some sense. It's like it appeals to women, so hence like right now there's a lot of conversation about Bridgerton, right? And on Netflix, and we've now reached a stage with season 2 where everybody's like, what is the Sharma doing in Bridgerton, and realism, and should we care about realism, and all of that conversation. But when the first announcement happened that Shonda Rhimes is going to convert Bridgerton into a Netflix show, I thought it was massive. I thought as a cultural event, it was massive. I didn't watch Bridgerton after 3 episodes because it really annoyed me. I'm a big romance novel reader, but the deal of making what appeals to women mainstream in that sense, as if it wasn't already mainstream. But when I say mainstream, to put money into it, okay, I think that's very cool. And I think the idea of somebody like Mira, who has huge appeal to women readers, for her to become mainstream, by which, I mean that, all kinds of people will buy her books. Maybe it'll become a movie. Maybe, there are big national prizes that will be won. Publishers will run after her. For me, this is a big event also, because it is a mark of a cultural shift, and to not say this is a feminized product, that it's only for ladies to sit in their ladies compartment.
I want to put it in a different way, ask you in a different way. I didn't mean to say it's
No, I mean,
to
no,
certain people.
I know, but for
But
me, it was an interesting connection.
no, but I want to ask you, whether, let's put it this way. Do you think A.R. Mira um, deconstructs the modern Indian woman better than many of the English language writers? There are writers who write primarily in English right now. Do you think like the regional language writers kind of tackle those subjects in a different way than people who write in English?
No,
Very interesting question.
no, I don't, because I mean, like, you could speak Malayalam or you could write in English, and if you're a certain kind of literary male writer, I mean, the woman continues to be that shadowy presence with 3 lines of dialogue, right? I mean, I loved Mustache. I read it in Malayalam, I read it in English. I recommend it to everybody. I bought multiple copies, but I still don't know what's going on with the women in that book. Okay, and at to an extent, I'm afraid to reread it and find out that I don't really like it, because there is that sort of quasi-rape moment, and there is whatever, and I'm like, oh man, if I look at it, this book I really love, it might not be a book I love that much. Okay, and that's true for men writing in all kinds of languages. You go to plays, and I mean, I can tell you the script of all kinds of plays and movies. It has a particular script. There is a genius, that's the man. There is a woman in the same field. She works very hard. Okay, his role in that story is to tell her that working hard is not the way to make good work. It's to be a genius. And then she continues to, like, be that character which assists the flowering of his genius. Now you can see this in a cartoon like Ratatouille. You can see it in theater written by Indian Americans, like say Paper Animals, that play. You can see it in all kinds of things. And I think that's like some weird instinct that male writers need to work out of their system. Like, they need to now say, oh, this is my formula. I need to get past the formula by being a cool person and do something else.
I think Zacharia said would have something to talk about it, because I think he is someone who doesn't care about what the readers think, whether the reader will take it this way. For example, he got beaten up by both the left and right in Kerala at different points. He got attacked by the left in 2010, I guess, and then right very recently. So spectrum covered, and I don't think he really cares about what the reader would think, whether they would. Or I don't know whether the most of the Malayali writers, including K.R. Mira and S. A. Rish, really thinks about I should have a strong female character, or I should have certain character. I should have a politically correct character. I don't know whether they think in that way, and that's probably one way their writings are kind of their writings kind of shine on us and kind of reflect on us.
I mean, I'm going to violently argue with you at this point, because that would mean that the stories that are produced unthought of in an instinctive way automatically always have a strong male character. Does this seem natural to you? No, right? So, I mean, why would it be one kind of way, and to do it in another kind of way would be unnatural? Writers are always thinking about structure. They're always thinking of structure. They're always thinking about form. And in some like tenuous and beautiful way, they're always thinking about the reader also. Like, writers are thinking about readers. How
Yeah.
they think and what is that mystic connection is, of course, up to them. But to say that to make the woman a central character or women's concerns central is artificial or overwrought, I mean, I would really question that.
Actually, I would agree with you on that rather than fighting, because I've also felt that certain writers, I don't want to name names, but certain writers,
Why?
when they are like really this humble, good-natured male guys, when you speak to them in person, but their writings, they're like overtly macho characters and all that. It has to be like they are compensating for their real lives and their fictional lives. I don't know. Zachariah sir, enlighten us.
So, you see, I can only talk for myself there, Nidheesh, because I make sure that, see, I am a 100% Malayali male. So it's all imprinted, the male dominance, the chauvinistic thing is here right from childhood. So one has to consciously throw that out. It takes years. Maybe it takes a removal from the Kerala scene to a city like Delhi, or which happened in my case, or Bangalore, or wherever it is, so that you see that people are behaving differently with women. People are thinking and looking at women in a different way. You learn to do that. You learn it. So in my case, I think I have not patronized women. I mean, created. I have not been patronizing to women, not patronized, patronizing to women. And I make sure. Unfortunately, I think some people are now saying that most of my women characters are the dominating characters, but I like it that way. That's okay. That's okay.
Well, you're
That is
Rosie in A Secret History of Compassion.
my.
It
No,
is
but it's
not
very
your.
easy to do that actually, because in many cases you can you see it adds, because it's very easy to bring a woman into a very unexpected kind of situation in a Malayalam story, because mostly you are expecting a man to do that. So
What a brilliant, yeah.
then when you bring the woman in and make her the key or the catalyst or whatever you want to call it, then the whole thing shifts. And I have been, if there is a woman, well, then she is a story, she is a master of the show. So for that, you have to change within yourself. Like you become a like me, you are a leftist, or I mean ideology changes. If you are a one of those communal fellows, then you can do that. If then you see you have to so you have
Actually,
to
Nidhesh,
change.
when you talked about OTT earlier,
Huh.
that's one of the things that really annoys me about the new Malayalam movies so far. The women are always crying. They never seem to stop crying in situations of crisis, while the men will be all like picking up their arms and walking around and doing things. The woman will be like, buckets of tears coming out of her. And it's like, why can't they see that ordinary women just don't cry or act like that anymore, even if
It
they
is
were meant to
it
or
is
expected?
changing, Karthika. Now in the hands of the younger directors, there is a change. Women are
Yeah, but not enough, Paul. I mean, what was
not
that
enough,
movie, the
not enough.
recent one, the
I
one
agree.
with the, that
Karthika, uh,
suspense one with the house where they're all in the haunted house? What was that movie recently, which got a lot of attention? Do you remember? On
this
Netflix,
is
I
the
think.
one with Revati, right?
Uh,
Bhutagalam.
is it that?
The one with Revati.
No, wasn't Revati. Where these guys are going on a trip and then there's a accident, freakish thing, and then they end up in this haunted house and
I know.
everyone's trying to kill
I
everyone.
forgotten the name. I know about this. Yeah.
All the men were out there, picking up themselves and
You,
trying to fight the spirits and all the rest of it or whatever. And the woman was just crying and crying and crying. So
this
that hasn't really changed enough.
a lot of these movies are written by men, right?
Exactly my point. Just like Nisha was talking about writers and all, the young directors and writers of movies are still doing that.
But Nisha, I'm wondering, whether isn't that changing at least, in literature, not to a great extent, but certainly in K.R. Mira's work, it has strong woman characters, and it connects with a lot of men and women, I guess, and those characters, because that's That's very contemporary. That's what
They do.
we see. Yeah.
They do. In fact, I was just mentioning it to Karthika last week that I mean, it's one thing for me as a writer to discover a kind of unexpected-ish readership in some ways, but to see Mira's readership in English is really fascinating for me. Just because of social media, people will tag you, like they tag me, and it'll be some dude in Gurgaon who's just read K.R. Mira's book for the first time, and it's the first book from Malayalam that he's read in English, and just like passionate response to it, and it's really enjoyable. Like I really trip on it. Like I feel very, very happy about it.
Okay. And do you see the same kind of response happening in the mainstream English writing space? I guess the mainstream novels that we have.
Is there a question for me?
Yeah.
So I don't know, because see, I wrote the collection of short stories just a little before that, so that was fairly recently. Most of my readership is female. Like most of my readership is female, and for me that works. I mean, I've been writing for over a decade, fiction and nonfiction, for women readers. I mean, I'm not someone who's thinking much about male readers actually. So it works fine. So this process of watching Mira's readership is interesting for me, and I'm really enjoying that.
Okay. And Zacharia sir, just to add to it, do you see this as going ahead when Malayalam literature becomes more popular and gets more translated, when our short stories get translated to English? Do you see a lot of these debates will surface? This because we are not talking to the average catering. These short stories will not be then catering to the average Malu reader. Then they'll be talking to a more sophisticated, more politically oriented pan-Indian reader. And the Malayalam literature is different. The way the Malayalam writers write is different from what they are used, what the national audience is kind of used to. What do you think?
The Malayalam literature that is being produced now by the younger generation, for example, basically it caters to a very live and alert and very critical and also appreciative audience of young people and middle age, all kinds of people in Malayalam, and they are also very active on the social media. So with the result, that as soon as in my times you wrote a short story and published it in the premium journal of that time, Mathrubhumi Weekly, which even now it is, you know about that story or what people think about it maybe 3 years later, maybe 4 years later. Yes, really. So, but today, as soon as it's published, your feedback is on the net. It's in your Facebook, it is in your Twitter or whatever. So the new generation writers are catering to an audience that is instantly responsive, sometimes very abusive, sometimes very communal. They will catch on to the smallest little detail of a communal reference to call him names or threaten him, etc., etc. That's also there. So it's a field now bristling with activity. But at the end of the day, short story and Malayalam writing as a whole is existing in a very live kind of. It's a minefield, I will say. Anything can happen, but it is very, very, very live and I see literature as going forward. I mean, as far as I'm not no prophet or anything, but it's moving forward and moving forward well. And the new generation has taken root. They have come to be accepted as the new writer, as the leading writers. The whole thing. So it has shifted. And as I said, they're very political. Thank God. That is a very, very, very important thing.
Okay.
When I say political, I don't know. Yeah, whatever.
It's not party politics also. They're not,
It is hopefully not. But no, it's not party politics. It's ideology of a certain kind, which is good, not of a rightist kind in any case.
Yeah. There are two audience questions. I think both are for Nisha. Tom Thomas is asking, how can one write Malayalam dialogues in English or in Indian English, to put it that way? He's saying he grew up in Nigeria, and like many Nigerians, authors use pidgin English in some of their writings that add a unique flavor. So he's saying he's wondering how this aspect, works when it comes to Malayalam dialogues when you translate both in predominantly English. He's asking whether as an English article or whether as an English novel.
So, I mean, this is a fairly standard problem for anybody translating. And so popularly, like people will tell you, even if they can't read the original, they'll be like, it is not as good as the original. So then you have to just shake your head and say, yes, yes. Okay. And then, I mean, then the job of the translator is to say that there's always going to be somebody who has never read the original and who's going to have these feelings. So mostly, I think the trick is to just think of what captures a feeling when you hear it. Like, I'll give you an example of a word that has come up over and over again in many conversations about Kabar, K.R. Mira's novella. The word chullan is the original, and in English I've used the word haughty. Now, the reader who's reading it is not like they read the word chullan and they're complaining to me, but like random people have asked me very like with big smiles, how did you decide to use this word haughty? So at first, I genuinely didn't understand what the problem was. And then I understood that it is that in a kind of literary fiction, you're not expecting to hear one casual, like bar, pub kind of word. Like, when you nudge someone and say, hey, there's a hottie. So, but it's actually the feeling of the original that you want to bring into the new book, because the feeling is what you want to give the reader. So that is like the ongoing and intrinsic problem of translation. So it's either you love it or you don't. I love it. I find it very entertaining to do. So you just keep doing.
Love the anecdote, especially because it's we talk in a different way, right? In Malayalam, we talk in a different way, and the moment we start to write, we write in a different way. It's like another language. It's we don't use certain words when we write. We don't use certain words that we write when we talk. So it's a very unique thing to us, I guess.
Yeah.
Yamini Nair is asking, how will this work when the original writer is not able to rewrite it themselves? She's asking.
I think this was in response to what Karthika and Paul was saying about tweaking his stories and how that created a trend in
actually, yes. Will that be fair? So she's asking, will that be fair on the original intent of the writer? Fair and true to the original intent of the writer.
If the writer is doing it himself or herself, where is the problem?
No, the question is, what if the writer can't? Then, and the editor is then taking on a larger role, in internally and sort of making
but Nisha, I'm sure there's a conversation going on between the editor, and the translator and the writer, and that should really, the editor will provide a certain kind of advice. Look, it's better to cut this and make it more compact. Like Karthika and I worked together on my novel. Well, this is a kind of thing that you rely on the editor for a better sense of the text than actually universal, because it's a third eye at work. So
it is a continuing conversation and a three-way conversation. If the author and the translator are available, then with both. Otherwise, with just the translator, maybe in some cases.
Yeah.
But I think it's never a decision that an editor could take without everyone being involved and happy with the end result.
What happens if the regional writer is not well versed in English? I
think they leave it to the translator to judge for themselves what they would like to see done. And as it happens, I think in Kerala and among the writers who are currently being published in translation, I think most of them are perfectly able to be part of the conversation. They may not intervene too much, but they will read the draft when it comes to them, and they will point out something that makes them uncomfortable. But for the most part, I think they leave it to the translator.
We have to wrap up. We have gone over time by 5 minutes, I guess. Thanks, everyone. It was very interesting to hear all the perspectives, and I believe it was a good discussion, despite the fact that I didn't prepare any of the questions and didn't talk to any of you guys beforehand. Thanks a lot. I think we can wrap up now. Lekha?
Thank you.
Seeing the number of questions we still have unanswered from the audiences, it's
Yes.
testament to the kind of sparkling conversation that we've had this evening. And thank you so much, Karthika, Paul Sir, Nisha, and Nidheesh for giving us an in into how this phenomenon of writing and translating works, not just in this lovely language, but also otherwise. Thank you all. I hope to see you all again. Thank you to the audiences that joined us and like have given us so many questions that hopefully we'll get to at some point in time. And all I can say now is good night and see you all next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
See you. Bye.
Thank you, Nidheesh.
Thanks, sir. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.